Welcome everyone to an NCVER webinar. Our topic today is what's going on in the vet system. We had over 500 registrations for this webinar. It's an NCVER record from all parts of the country and the vet system. My name is John King. I am the Managing Director of the National Centre for Vocational Education Research. I'll be facilitating today's webinar, which will be recorded, is being recorded and placed on our website. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continued spiritual connection to land. I'm joining you from the lands of the Kaurna people. I pay my respects to elders past and present. Our agenda today is pretty straightforward. We're going to have a discussion as a panel, and then we will open up for Q&A. For those new or rusty to Zoom, you will see a little Q&A box, sort of bottom middle of your screen, most likely. You can ask questions at any time during the webinar. Your questions will be logged and we'll show them all once the Q&A session opens. Okay, so ask questions anytime, but we'll hold them for the session. If we can't respond during the webinar, don't fret, we will do our best to come back to you offline by email. I want to tell you three things about the webinar before I introduce the panel and we get started. The inspiration for today is that adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words. The pictures today are some simple charts, 10 of them if time allows. Each will show you a different picture of the system, who is studying vet, what are they studying, and where are they studying. The words are the words of our expert panelists on what's going on, segueing, our hope is, into some important debates and maybe even some persistent myths on our sector. The second thing is underpinning our webinar today is data from NCVER's total vet collection. It was released on the 5th of September, our 2023 data. It covers all nationally recognised training, 5.1 million students, 36 million subject enrolments, 3,600 registered training providers all contribute to that set. And I want to thank upfront all of the people who make that data possible, students who study, the trainers who teach, the RTOs who report it, my NCVER team who collects, cleans, curates it, and the governments and their departments who open it for transparency. Final thing is this webinar is a test. It's an experiment. Is this a useful way that NCVER can curate insights into the vet system? Please give us your feedback offline. We'll send you a survey. If you think this has potential, we'll do more of them and better. So following launches of our publications into completions, apprenticeships, student surveys, other good things. So please send us your feedback. We now introduce our panel. Craig Robertson is the Chief Executive Officer of the Victorian Skills Authority. Jodie Trembath, Director of Skills, Employment and Small Business at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Troy Williams, Chief Executive and Company Secretary of Independent Tertiary Education Council Australia. And Dave Coltman, Chief Executive of TAFE SA. Jeannie Dodd from TAFE Directors Australia sends her apologies. All right, let's begin. Our first picture is a gentle start. We are showing you here student numbers over time by type of training. So let me explain what this is showing. If you look at the horizontal axis, it shows year from 2015, when this data set was created, to the latest data of 2023. The vertical shows students measured in thousands, so translates into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 million. And the data from bottom to top are short courses, the green line at the bottom, so training package skill sets, accredited courses. The dark blue, qualifications. So training package qualifications, accredited qualifications, certificate 1 and up. The purple are standalone subjects like CPR or first aid, responsible service of alcohol. And the line at the top is the total, the light blue. Craig Robertson, what's clear, what's surprising, what's confusing from this picture?
Good on you, thanks, John. And I want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. This presents a couple of interesting things. The first one is that there, in any one year, particularly in 2023, there's 5.1 million connections between vet and a citizen. Notice I didn't say 5.1 million students, because the student could be going back for 2 or 3 goes in any one year. A couple of other observations. It is interesting to see the growth in standalone subjects and look at that rate of growth. And whilst there has been a bit of growth recently in full qualifications, that is declining in a small amount, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then for those of you who've been in the sector for a while, who lived through the trauma that skill sets were going to destroy the vet system, skill sets really haven't had too much of an impact in the skill system, which is an interesting observation. The issue between qualifications and subjects, that's where I'm going to say it's a disturbing trend in the sector. And the reason I say that is that VET has been structured around the notion of competency, and the heritage of competency that we inherited from our motherland in the late 80s was all around competencies to prepare you for, in a well-rounded way, for an occupation. And clearly what's going on, people are coming in and just picking bits and pieces of it. So is it meaning that we are not preparing people fully for to be completely skilled for the needs of an occupation? That would be my particular issue. Or whether in fact there are people just coming through and picking up small number of units because they need that for progressing in their career. The danger will be if that's a substitution for a qualification. That's an issue for VET that I suspect has been around for a while, and if that trajectory continues, presents some risk to the VET sector.
That's great. Troy, Jodie, David, you want to weigh in on this?
Well, thanks, John. It is an interesting one. When you look at the qualification rate, it's been pretty stable since 2017. In fact, if you would overlay that with population growth, you would argue we're falling behind. When we look at the standalone qualifications, I would agree with Craig here. There is a point of concern where I think most people on the call would want full qualifications to be the entry point into a career. But in some cases, that isn't always the case. And if we look at the uptake in standalone subjects, probably the largest single one is those grouped in the first aid area, the first aid certificate. Around 1 million of those a year, which are required with many jobs. Allied to that is, of course, the RSA, the Responsible Service of Alcohol Unit, which again is a pathway to employment. And then there's others in, say, the forklift area. So while there is a concern that we're probably not seeing the growth in full qualifications that we'd like, it would be hard to dismiss the growth in standalone qualifications because many of those are job facing.
Can I just raise a question here that this speaks to me is, have we got a system that is creating qualifications that are not what people want or what industry wants or require? So are we investing significantly in a model that sees the development of qualifications that are somewhat out of touch with the expectations of either students or the industry that is asking them to undertake study? This signals to me, a static sort of response. 2023, we'd had a major curriculum renewal sort of over the 3 previous years that one could have argued might have had some impact, but it appears not. So a significant investment that was absorbed largely by providers and their staff. To what effect?
Thanks, David. Jodie, do you want to weigh in here, or
yeah, if that's all right. I think that's a really good point, David. I think that if we're not putting forth qualifications that people want to do or need for their careers, then in fact we are in trouble. And what really gives me pause about that very flat looking line in the qualifications is that the government has accepted the recommendations from the university's Accord final report. And one of those recommendations was that we should increase the tertiary attainment figure it's currently sitting at the 60% rate, and they're wanting to increase that to 80% by 2050. So that's the number of people who have a Cert 3 or higher, and that's at least one Cert 3 or higher. So if we're going to increase by that amount, then that flat line is a real problem. And David's point becomes even more pertinent, because maybe the qualifications are not the qualifications that we're actually needing in order to move forward with that kind of aspiration.
Thank you, Jodie. I'm going to come back to qualifications and their alignment. I'm going to move now to the next picture. So what we're showing you here, a picture of students by funding source. The horizontal axis shows 3 categories: domestic government funded students, so around 1.3 million. In the middle, domestic full fee paying students, around 3.9 million. And then far right are international full fee paying students, around 300,000, 295,000 with our data. Students can, of course, as Craig pointed out, undertake more than one type of training. The vertical axis shows you percentage, and the data that you can see there is from the bottom, standalone subjects in purple, short courses in green, and qualifications in dark blue. It's all 2023. David, what do you see in this picture? What's it showing?
Now, the interesting thing for me here was whether it was the funding that was driving the behaviour, or whether it was what the enrolments were in. So whether it was whether a domestic student is taking a qualification because they need a qualification, be enrolled in a qualification to get the subsidised rate. Because it speaks to me of a much bigger issue, which is, and Craig, I apologise for any therapy this might cause you, but we don't have a comprehensive funding student loans scheme in VET that is equivalent to the higher education offer. So of course, domestic full fee paying students will be in shorter courses because they're having to find that from their own pockets. And we know that sort of a larger proportion of disadvantaged students choose to study within the vocational education sector more broadly. And so you're asking those with the least to contribute directly out of their pocket, not on a deferred basis. So I was actually surprised with the domestic full fee, the volume doing qualifications. That's almost 20%, 1 in 5, actually paying for their qualification without subsidy. And that surprised me as a significant amount. I had some operational questions that would challenge, that may be part of that issue about how we apply policy at an operational level, and do we make it so hard for people to access some of the domestic funding that's available that they just prefer to get in and pay it themselves. A proposition for exploring.
Thank you, David. Just interested, Craig, you want to pick that up, or we can keep moving?
Well, my response would be, albeit we can't make a direct comparison to the previous slide, but if you look at domestic government funded students in the almost 92% in qualifications, that would indicate a high rate of non-completion, or is it always the case that they're only ever coming in to do a set number of units which they wanted, because most governments around Australia will encourage enrolment in the full qualification. And so sometimes are we shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to completions, where in fact a student was never intending to complete, but they were forced to enrol in the full qualification. It's quite a conundrum actually for policy people.
I like that point, Craig. And so maybe if we think of the slide before where it seemed like the skill sets were pretty low, maybe they're happening de facto through qualifications. It's just that we can't see it as well.
Yeah.
And if I can, John, this is just simply an outcome of government funding patterns. If we look at government-funded domestic students, states and territories overwhelmingly fund full qualifications, particularly for those getting into a career. So in some respects, the data is to be expected.
Yeah. Okay. Show you the next picture. There is, of course, an ongoing debate, and it has been for a long time, about the role of different training providers in the VET system. This picture shows you the share of some different markets by provider type. So in the horizontal, you have 4 different markets: students, qualifications, and then qualifications that were part of an apprenticeship or traineeship. And so you can see the two columns at the end there are split by trades and non-trades. The vertical axis shows you the market share in percentage. And then the data from, I'll go this time from top to bottom, the private or independent training providers, dark blue, TAFEs in green, community education providers in purple, and other here includes universities, schools, and enterprise RTOs are light blue. Troy, what's going on here?
What the data shows is the true strength of the skills training system. The complementary roles played by public TAFE colleges, independent RTOs, of course, including enterprise RTOs, community colleges, for-profit, not-for-profit. It also shows the diverse nature of the qualifications offered, and we'll get to this later on, where TAFE has a really good solid role in what we would call traditional trades. Conversely, the role of independent RTOs, as I said, TAFE has a strong role in traditional trades, but it can't be everything to everyone everywhere. And what we hear is the strong role of independent providers, offering qualifications which quite often aren't necessarily prioritised by government, so don't often feature in the scope of registration of TAFE colleges. And also across rural, regional, remote Australia, it's just simply not possible to have a TAFE college in every town, where it is possible to operate sustainably in independent RTO. So what we have here is a really good set of 4 graphs that shows the strength of the skills training system, where predominantly 4,000 independent RTOs certainly support the majority of students, but is also reflected, as I said, in the strong role of traditional trades, the strong role of TAFE in supporting traditional trades.
Thanks, Troy. Jodie, Craig, David, anything to add?
Yeah, just picking up on what Troy was saying there about location, and I think this will come up in the next slide as well, but I think that there are actually quite a lot of different opportunities for students to study in regional and remote areas, and that isn't necessarily being taken advantage of. We have seen the release in the last 12 to 18 months of a whole lot of new regional study hubs. They've been named regional university study hubs, which is actually untrue. Any student from VET can study in a regional study hub, and so that's a missed opportunity through that name, but it's not a missed opportunity for students to take advantage of that. And that has a whole lot of those study hubs have a whole lot of wraparound services and study support in ways that can really make a genuinely interactive online experience for VET students. So I just wanted to highlight that thought because I think it's something that's because of that naming getting missed.
Thanks,
John. A couple of comments from me. Acknowledge Troy's comment about the spread of providers. One thing that does worry me, and it's a little bit silly of me saying that Victoria has a regional challenge when I'm looking at somebody who's setting up TAFE SA and I look north of the border, but I do wonder whether our qualifications create too many artificial thin markets that make it nigh on impossible to deliver in regional areas. And in fact, a bit of work that I think Jobs and Skills Australia has shown that in terms of equitable access to vocational education and training, we potentially have a qualification system that acts as a barrier for that. And I do think we really need to think about that seriously. Then on the right hand, the 2 bars, the trade qualifications, non-trade qualifications, and the split there. What will be interesting is this is 2023. If we go forward a couple of years and we see the impact of the Commonwealth's changes to incentives to employers, which fundamentally is skewed towards trade qualifications, it'll be interesting to see what happens, I guess, in number terms for non-trade qualifications, because in some part, they are triggered by the incentive to assist the employer to take on a trainee in particular.
Yeah. Thank you, Craig. And we've talked about place a couple of times. I think that leads nicely into this picture. So this shows you qualification enrolments by location of the student. So the student, not the provider. So the chart on the left, the horizontal shows 3 categories: major cities, regional, remote, ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics categories. The vertical shows qualification enrolments by percentage. And then the data, as always, bottom to top, TAFE institutes in green, dark blue, private or independent providers, purple, community education, and light blue, again, is other. It's all 2023. And then the map on the right is a heat map of the data where colour indicates the concentration of enrolments. So you see the red hot supernova of Melbourne right to the sort of slight green if you look in Alice Springs. David, how does place matter for vet delivery?
Well, what this has showed, it's quite interesting, is that the variance in enrolments is not impacted by where the people are. So in terms of which provider people are accessing, it sort of dispels the myth that, TAFEs are out there doing it in the regions and remote areas exclusively because of the thin markets. And I think what's changed has really been digitization and delivery of using different modes post-COVID. We developed a capability as a sector to meet the needs of people during the pandemic, and that's continued. I don't think anyone is not involved in partial digital delivery, at least. So where students can commence study at home, wherever that home may be, and then perhaps enrolments may require them to move to a centre to go. I'm also interested to know what happened to Sydney, whether they've been exported to New Zealand or what.
Urban sprawl.
Exactly.
I think it's just a spread out. Yes.
No, I'm just being slightly facetious there for my Sydney colleagues and friends. So I thought it was a very interesting spread there. Again, we then need to look at the point that Craig raised around qualifications versus short courses or units, skill sets. And what we would observe is more of those are being consumed by people in the regions because that's what's on offer. And there's less choice, etc., because of that sort of marketed model that says we need to be financially sustainable in the delivery of education, which I struggle with. But I will talk to that at some point about the ludicrousy of market models.
And to add to the parochialism, I just need to add, for the benefit of everybody online, that Melbourne is now the largest metropolitan area population in Australia.
As is demonstrated by its traffic jams. It's interesting too when you look at another set of data other than qualifications, but include short courses and standalone. And that's where the issue of thin markets really becomes quite interesting, because then you've got a pretty even split here between private providers and taking qualifications. But when you get to short courses, it changes radically. You get about 9 in 10 students are then with independent RTOs. And that's quite often for that particular workplace in that particular region. It's accessible at a local level. So you do get very different data if you're picking up David's point, if you look at not full qualifications, but start to roll in the standalone units and also short courses.
Okay. Vet is, of course, closely linked to occupations and labour markets. This picture shows you change in training package qualification enrolments. So the time period we're showing you here is 2015 to 2023. Along the horizontal, you'll see training packages. These are the top 10 training packages by enrolment. The vertical axis shows you the change in qualification enrolments over the period. So up 100,000 increase, down to 150,000 decrease. And so, for example, on the left, you'll see community services enrolments have increased by 80,000 over the period 2015 to 2023. Just to give you a sense of scale, the row right at the bottom of the slide gives you a sense of size. So community services, again, bottom left, had 442,000 odd enrolments in 2023. Jodie, what does this picture tell you about the vet sector?
Yeah, there's quite a lot happening in this slide. So coming from an employer perspective, I actually think the most worrying decline on this slide is also the smallest one, and that's the construction qualifications. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, I suspect that most of those larger declines in business services, transport and logistics, IT, and financial services, they may actually be being cannibalized by the higher education market. And while that's not great for the vet sector, admittedly, I'm less concerned for the economy. I'm less concerned for society more broadly by that kind of trend, particularly because these are still, as John just said, some of the most popular vet qualifications despite those declines. But any kind of decline in construction enrolments, I think, is a really significant concern. I mean, we simply don't have enough tradies to do all the things. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. We're trying to transition to net zero. We have a government who wants us to have a future made in Australia. So to be seeing declines in construction enrolments in construction trades, that's really not good. On the growth side, it's not a surprise to see growth in community services. That's things like early childhood services, youth work, disability support services, employment services. What else? Community development more broadly, housing support. So I think this reflects that kind of growing trend towards a services economy. And I think people are investing in qualifications and careers that they feel can't be automated, that the robots are not going to come for those jobs. And that's probably a smart investment. And just finally, as I said, there's quite a lot happening on this slide. I think it's interesting to see that increase in tourism, travel and hospitality qualifications. I attended the OECD Tourism Committee meeting last week, and one of the trends that they were talking about was this anti-tourism, anti-tourist sentiment and also protests happening across Europe. I wonder if we're going to start seeing an uptick in response to those kinds of trends. Be good to see that we are seeing an increase in the people that we have qualified in those sectors if that does come about. That's probably my thoughts, John.
Thanks, Jodie. Checking with the panel, anything else you're seeing? Yeah.
I'd like to come in, John, and it's an interesting one, whether you look at some of these trend changes or indication of structural change. So when you look at the community services, you can see that as sort of a ongoing trend. But if you go across to the right, and if you look at information and communication technology, that's a decline of almost 38,000 down to 59,000. So there's almost that the enrolments are shrunk by half. And if you look at transport and logistics, that's even more than that. Business services looks like a big decline, but there's a fair number of enrolments. So you tend to say that's trend. But on the ICT package and the T&L package, they should be major alarm bells for the relevant jobs and skills councils to say what's going on. Is the industry technically walking away from training? Is the training poorly defined and therefore not hitting the mark, or anything else? But they really strike me. And then just on the financial services, there has been the trend for that to move into higher education, but that's equally a bit of a structural change, but possibly part of an ongoing trend.
Could I add to that? When I look at the community services, I see MDIS. I see a requirement for a new work skill that's accelerated the enrolments in that area. And sort of conversely, at the other end is the less regulated industries are seeing decline. So is it the regulatory requirement that's driving the enrolments rather than a demand or change in demand pattern? I do think the higher education demand or overlap with vet is seeing some impact. And for me, from an economic perspective, that's a significant issue, because it costs a lot more to take someone through university than it does to take them through a vet program. And so we spend 4 times as much to get about the same return. And so you kind of have to start doing, if we're going to look value, let's look around the sector rather than within the sector for value.
Thank you. Troy.
I was going to say there's certainly some work here for the Jobs and Skills Councils to unpack, particularly as has been pointed out, the concerning drop in construction and financial services, and particularly ICT, where we need the skills. It's of some interest that there's been growth in foundation skills. And this would highlight the fact that in a full employment environment, we're doing what we can to get more people into the workforce, including those who have been disengaged. And there's probably some also work to be done as whether we're picking up from perhaps failings of the secondary school system. So, certainly the growth in foundation skills are merited because it supports people into further study or into a career, but the underlying cause for that would, really does merit some consideration.
Thank you, everyone. And to pick up a point that Jodie and several of you made, I think it will be fabulous when we can see integrated tertiary education data so that we can start to see better what's happening in schools and in tertiary, as well as perhaps into non-accredited training. We'll move now to different topics. So increasing attention on gender and age in recent years, which I think is fabulous. This picture, and there's even more going on here, this picture is of the top 20 training packages by qualification enrolments. So let me break it down. The horizontal axis, so along the bottom, shows gender balance as a percentage. So to the right means more men, to the left means more women. The vertical axis shows average age in years. So higher means an average older student population, lower means a younger student population. And the data, the dots show you the average position for each training package. And the size of the bubble corresponds with the size of the package. So for example, on the top left, you can see the largest package, community services, has an average age of, call it 33, and about 80% female. Jodie, what do you notice in this picture?
I would say this is an excellent visual representation of what JSA highlighted back in 2023 when they released their initial skills priority list. So they had a whole section outlining the fact that when you see an industry with a heavy gender skew in either direction, chances are that that industry is going to also be in skills shortage. So even though this chart is about enrolments, and it's about enrolments in the top 20 training packages, implying that we do have decent numbers of enrolments in these qualifications, those courses that are heavily gender skewed, such as construction and plumbing, transport and logistics, IT on the far right, and hairdressing and beauty services and health on the far left, if you look at the JSA occupational shortage list, these are largely occupations that are in shortage, while occupations in areas that are sitting in the middle of that chart, business, property, retail, they're largely not. So what this means for industries with these gender skews is that even if training enrolments are high, the resulting workforce may still not be sufficient to actually meet demand. Now, there's obviously lots of work being done at the moment, particularly with bringing women into non-traditional roles and industries. That's incentive programs, things like that. But I think we're going to need to see a huge cultural shift for that to occur. I'm not sure we're there yet. The construction cultural task force is doing work on this. I think that's really exciting. I'll be really keen to see where that ends up. So that kind of covers what I'd like to say about the gender aspect. There's also the age aspect though of this slide. So we're also seeing where people are enrolling younger or older, and perhaps as they're coming back to study for the purposes of a career change, either to upskill or to reskill. So you can see that the training and education package is the significant one that's sitting up highest in the older age brackets. Makes a lot of sense. People have had a successful career in a trade and now they want to pass on that knowledge that they've acquired to new generations. But I think it's really interesting that the average age across the board here is as high as it is. I think the rhetoric when we talk about VET is often talking about school leavers or even VET in schools, and that's clearly not the key thing that's happening on this slide, which sort of tells us that there is really a market for VET in being that kind of reskilling and upskilling way to move forward for people who are looking for a new lease on their career, I suppose.
Thanks, Jodie. Panel.
Of some concern is that average age of the training and education training package student cohort. As Jodie's pointed out, a lot of times it's existing workers deciding to work in the vet workforce, but it also creates challenges for the vet workforce itself. If they're entering at relatively late age, we're not going to see them work for 20, 30 years, probably only 10 or 15. So we're going to see a lot of churn. Conversely, when you look at where the age is quite low, it's where there are predominantly traineeships and apprenticeships. Hairdressing and beauty, retail services, a lot of traineeships, and then the construction ones. Yeah, that's where you do see a lot of school leavers head into traineeships and apprenticeships. It's not to dismiss them elsewhere, but that's where it is heavy. The sport, recreation, fitness is almost at the very bottom. It isn't surprising. It is very strong in vetting schools programs. And it will be interesting to see whether the number of enrolments there continue, with the Queensland indicating that it's going to be largely defunded as part of its vetting schools program, whether we see some changes there. But look, as I said, probably the main thing is that we do have problems with the vet workforce. The average age of those undertaking the qualifications is of concern. And as I said, the younger ages, it's just interesting. It's well, the average age is younger. It is interesting that that's predominantly where the apprenticeships and traineeships are at their strongest.
Troy, I'm going to move us now to, we'll stay with training packages, but this takes you back to the top 10, and it's another take on where providers tend to play. Shows you a share of qualification enrolments, again, by provider type. So the horizontal along the bottom shows you the percentage share. The vertical shows you the training packages from the largest at the top to the smallest at the bottom, or the 10th to the 10th largest at the bottom. The enrolment data is cut by provider type to show you the share. So TAFE is green on the left, independent providers dark blue, community education purple, and other again is light blue. David, a different take on what we talked about earlier. What do you see that's going on here? What does this tell you about the provider market?
It tells me the provider market is looking at the cost to supply in terms of where it's pitching itself. So expensive programs or programs that require expensive kit tend to be picked up within the public system because of access to resource and a longer term return or investment. Because there's a risk profile around, investing in the equipment associated with the automotive industry and training requires a long-term commitment where, our funding arrangements have been year by year in the sector. We've moved to the sort of multi-year funding now. So it doesn't surprise me. I think, when Troy, we were talking about earlier, the traditional trades being the dominant space for TAFEs to play, I think that's more to do with the cost of the equipment that's required, the investment in facilities and space. And so that's what I see reflected very carefully here. And also regulation being the other one, where the regulation of an industry for its people to have passed a certain qualification in order to achieve a remuneration increases or whatever. In the deregulated, you see the private markets model sort of more responding, if you like, and the structure of the traditional market dominating where TAFEs are strong in terms of proportion. That's what I thought.
Troy, anything you want to pick up?
As much as I really do appreciate David's insights, his little different view on this one. This reflects the skewing of government funding models. If you look at automotive, retail repair and service, electrotechnology, building construction, government funding models overwhelmingly support students to study with public providers, and this reflects that. Conversely, when you look at other areas, business services, community services, tourism and hospitality, we see a lot of fee-for-service here. And some of these programs aren't cheap to deliver. In fact, healthcare is a good one, where nursing is horrendously expensive to deliver to a high-quality standard, and yet the share here is equal. But I do agree with David. What you do see here is the strength and the diversity, and sometimes the specialisation, whether it's in resources and infrastructure. In other areas which aren't on this graph, such as aviation, some of those are quite expensive programs to deliver, or highly industry-focused ones, where you see independent RTOs and their strong linkages with business really excel. But as I said, this really goes back to an earlier comment I made about the complementary nature of the skills training system, the really strong role that TAFE has in traditional trades, and of course the strong role that independents, RTOs, have across the sector.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you, David. Just two more pictures before we open for Q&A. This picture shows you the spread of enrolments in training package qualifications. So in 2023. So the horizontal shows you the number of qualifications ordered by size from the most on the left to the least on the right, or 0 on the right. The vertical axis shows you the number of enrolments in each qualification from 0 to 110,000. So the green section, highlighted green, it's 152 qualifications in there, which accounted for 85% of all enrolments. And if you're interested, the first three quals, the highest is the Cert 3 in individual support. Next, Cert 3 in early childhood education, and the Cert 3 in business are those three dots right to the top left. The white section shows the next 15% of enrolments, 759 qualifications. And then there were 229 qualifications that had no enrolments in 2023. Craig, what does this picture tell you about the VET system and our qualifications?
So if the qualification stock was equivalent to the stock that Woolworths needed to run in one of their warehouses, Woolworths would go broke if they use this model, right? We've got an inventory that's built on a set of expectations that are just not being seen in reality. And so this is part of the challenge that's being really presented to the skills system in a number of ways. One is, in the review conducted in Victoria, Jenny Macklin made the point very much that many qualifications are too narrowly based. Then because they're applied in a particular way, they create artificially thin markets. Then I'm sure David Coltman would agree to this. The fact the way they're constructed gives rise to churn of those qualifications. The vet sector is spending all of its time trying to keep track of qualification currency. Then in view of challenges of funding, it is little wonder that every RTO is gravitating to the left. And it's in some ways, you could try to point the finger in various different ways, but fundamentally this is a system. This is the VET systems challenge, right? The National Skills Agreement says that we're wanting to grow the relevance of VET and the like, and we fundamentally got a product set operating in a series of, in an ecosystem that is not working. And I can't emphasize this enough, because in the end, we end up offering to students a very narrow outcome. And I would say that 99.5% of students are rational, and they'll make a set of decisions to say, I'm not taking that on. This is really a fundamental problem for VET that really seriously needs to be looked at. Now, I can say that because I'm leading a piece of work on advice to ministers about our qualification system, and this is essentially what's driving that qualification, the review that was requested by Brendan O'Connor.
Thanks, Craig. Let's check panel. Troy, David, Jodie, anything to pick up on this one?
Craig's raised a really good point, and there is real concern with the 229 qualifications had 0 enrolments as to what's driving that. But when you look at the long end of the tail, some of these are highly specialised qualifications. Those dealing with dangerous animal handling. We were joking in a preparatory video conference before that you may not get very many undertaking the units in snake handling, but we're eternally glad that when someone turns up to catch the snake in the backyard that they have. In other areas which are crucial to the agenda of state and territory governments, wind turbine installation, critically important qualification, but with low enrolment. So we need to balance out. Now, there may well be too many units of competency. I'm not quite sure why we need 6 for a pocket calculator, but we seem to have 6 different units of competency to teach us how to use a pocket calculator. So it's just a case of really, in the way of trying to consolidate the number of units of competency, just being sure that we do allow that specialisation where it's genuinely required to have a standalone qualification.
Can I add the cost for the sector in maintaining these qualifications, both in terms of currency, but then in terms of quality and accreditation, is just obscene and it's outrageous. Having arrived at an organisation at a difficult time, and we had a long tail of qualifications that hadn't had enrolments for many years, but we're maintaining current TASs and curriculum expertise because we interpreted that was a requirement. But and that is, I just think, an unrealistic expectation, particularly when you apply some sort of marketisation on top of it. It's nonsense again.
Stephen, last picture. Yeah, pretty straightforward on this one. Our final picture shows you, again, a different lens, qualification enrolments by level of education. So again, we've gone 2015 through to 2023. And, this dates me a bit. When I joined the vet sector, call it early 2010, there was a target for raising the numbers of high-level qualifications, which was then defined as Certificate 4 or above. The horizontal axis shows qualification level from Certificate 1 to diploma or higher. The vertical shows enrolments as a percentage. The two data points in the light blue are 2015 and 2023. Troy, what do you see in this picture?
What we see is an increasing focus, as we've seen in universities and elsewhere, for higher level qualifications. The growth in Certificate 3, I think many would view as pleasing. Similarly, the growth in Certificate 4, the diploma and advanced diploma, we have to unpack. But really what we're seeing is qualifications being used as the entry point. It is interesting when you overlay this one with skill sets, you see a radically different picture. But really, full qualifications continuing to be the entry point for work. This reflects that. I would temper that sort of positive view, though, in that graph we saw earlier that showed that full qualification enrolments really haven't moved that much in the last few years.
Yeah, it's a good point. So we've seen it about the same level. It's more the mix that's changed over time, not the quantum of qualifications. Jodie, Craig, David, anything more to add on this? Okay.
The only thing I'd add is a system that's facing some macro change or pressures in some ways is reverting to its core, which we'd always think is Certificate 3 and 4 if you look at it in the context of the previous slide and sort of the statement that David made about we had all these things on scope, but we're rationalising down. It's quite logical that you go to your core, which would be your Cert 3s and 4s.
Okay. I might call that time on the panel section. So we've got, let's call it 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So I think what's going to happen now is you'll see all of the questions that have been asked so far come through, and there are over 30. So I just, a heads up, we won't be able to answer them all now, but we will do our best to come back to you offline. I might start with one to the panel, and it's an issue that we talked about earlier about short courses, standalone and qualification. The question is, re the debate over the relative decline in qualification and standalones. Is it that the world is a lot more dynamic and requiring of specific skills, so done by standalone and thus quicker to achieve, rather than the more comprehensive program, full qualifications that take longer? Said the drop in the number of qualifications on its own is concerning. I might just here, before I open it up for views, just add a definitions point. What's the difference between a short course and a standalone subject? So in the short courses, the subjects are grouped together into a training package, skill sets or accredited courses. Standalones are subjects that are not delivered as part of the program. That's the distinction in that chart, which I'll take you back to in a moment. But anyone on the panel that debate qualifications and standalones, what's going on? Next one.
I'll jump in as a starting point.
Yeah, go, Jo.
So I unfortunately don't think that this slide suggests that we are moving towards more of a, more of a dynamic and perhaps stackable way of doing education. mostly because of what you said at the beginning, John, about the majority of those standalone subjects being responsible service of alcohol, first aid, and workplace health and safety. I think that the government would very much like for this to mean that, and that's certainly something that I think some employers would like to see, because there is value in being able to say, I have employees who have generalist skills and now I want them to be able to upskill into something more specialist. But I think that the jury's really out on that. I think that other employers and employer groups, industry groups, really feel that that is a gateway drug, I suppose, into not having full qualifications and having sort of genuinely underqualified employees coming into the workplace. So I think that the government would like to think, yes, that is what we're seeing there, and that is the way, that kind of on-demand kind of trend that we're seeing in lots of different areas of society. But I don't think that that's what we're seeing here.
Thank you, Jodie. Next question. Question is, given we now have a relatively open access university higher education system, how big an issue is it that VET is about skills updating and skills broadening, plus supporting work-based learning, like but not limited to apprenticeships? I want to have a crack at that.
Well, in some ways, this is the issue, isn't it? At a time where there is the federal government trying to say, I'm wanting to have a bit more connected tertiary education system, in many parts, this would be showing this slide, and the question would be showing we're a bit in chalk and cheese territory, because during this time, albeit I understand higher ed enrolments have dropped a bit, people are expressing a desire to undertake a full qualification as the starting point and the springboard for their career, and that's not being expressed in the same way in vocational education and training. So it is signalling that VET has a different perspective or attitude from citizens. Whether in fact that's a problem and VET becomes the rapid go-to system for skilling, I think that's I think that's a folly, particularly if you've seen that the government has responded to the Accord attainment targets to say we need to get to 90%. That 90% will not be in a bull's roar of being able to be addressed solely by universities. So VET has to fundamentally rethink its structures, in my view, if it's going to try to assist in meeting that 90% attainment target.
And John, the other issue too is to consider is the role in VET in workforce reskilling and upskilling, particularly when there's been changes to technology. That's not to dismiss the role of higher education in that space, but where you've got job-facing, quite frankly, technical skills, you'll continue to see the growth in short courses and individual skill sets as part of that reskilling and upskilling work. And this is where we need to change the university and higher education and skills training funding models. We've got two different loan programs. We've got nearly 70 different ways to fund qualifications in VET with different government funding programs. The ability to create a single loan program, a more integrated funding model to allow people to dip into skills training and higher education throughout their working lives is something that's needed, something that JSA is turning its mind to. Of course, the challenge there is the states and territories.
Can I, remind us that the Foundation of Young Australians talked about 5 careers in a lifetime now, rather than a single career. So, I don't think there's any shortage of market or people wanting and needing training. It's how accessible, how do people want to obtain the new skills. And I think for us as a sector, what we need to be looking at is how we become future informed or future focused in our delivery, rather than delivering to the skills of today, because I think they've got very limited currency.
John, I think the VET sector could do itself a big favour, and this is a bit of shameless cross promotion here for NCVER research work, by actually thinking about categorising some of its qualifications as initial and then continuing vet or whatever, because we just sort of treat them all the same. But industry knows that they're there for a particular purpose and react that way. But we have them being used in a particular way. So some years back, NCVER did a research project on initial continuing vet, triggered mainly because that's a bit of a construct in Europe. But that research found, having spoken to the stakeholders, that they didn't sort of, they didn't agree that was needed. But I think that sort of the Lamonge of our qualifications causes us to sort of lose sight of some of the commentary. For example, Troy said about some of this is upskilling. Part of our problem is we treat upskilling in a full qual, and then we panic that people are exiting after their 2 or 3 units that they wanted to do, and we see that as a failure, where in fact they've met their upskilling challenge that they've wanted. So there are some structural things I think we need to look at as a sector.
I'm very interested in those structural things, Craig, and thank you. Always happy for some cross promotion. I might make the next one, if I come back to funding, I might make this the last question. Just the question goes, just an observation on the statistics on slide 10, which you should have in front of you. Do you think the government funding and focus on particular industry has a strong influence on what people want to study? So for example, less support from government on construction industry reflects declining course take-up despite national demand and requirement for trade, versus heavy funded government schemes like NDIS tend to have an increase in courses taken up on community services. So it's a question, general question for the panel is government's driving this picture? How much is it funding that's driving this picture, and how much of it is legitimate industry demand?
I would have to say the government has a huge role to play in what courses are available, number one. So you can have demand for things, but if it's not available, the numbers are impacted. In different jurisdictions, it's treated differently, but there's a large volume of delivery that is not activity-based or activity-funded. It's capped, and therefore, of course, government is influencing where the enrolments lie, and is subject to persuasion around that.
I would agree with that. I would also say that the flip side of that is that we have seen in the higher education sector, the Job Ready Graduate Scheme that was brought in sort of in the COVID years was intended to influence students using government funding to take up degrees in areas of skills shortage or areas of national priority for the government, and it has not worked. It has been an absolute dismal failure, and students, certainly in higher ed, have shown that they will study what they want to study and they don't really care what the government says. That said, higher education is very different because of the HECS loan system and the potential to defer thinking about the payment. I do think that in VET, I think students are making more economically rational decisions. So I think the influence is higher there.
And I agree with Jodie on that one, and certainly David. Government skills funding does skew full qualification enrolments, not only what they can study and where they can study, but who they can study it with. It's hardly a market that's adorned with student choice. That said, in some areas, if we look at in nursing qualification, it never ceases to astound me the number of students who pay their own way, either out of their pocket or sometimes get a vet student loan to study that qualification, and the high quality providers delivering in that area. The other thing too is the number of employers who pay for their staff's qualification is also something to be increasingly considered. But when you look at the data across training package qualification enrolments, government funding biases certainly do distort the numbers.
Thank you, Troy. And thank you everyone for coming. I'd like to thank the panel, Jodie, Troy, Craig, David. Thank you very much for your time. There are several ways on screen that you can connect to NCVER and our work. All the data that we showed you today is available on the NCVER website through our tools. Feel free to go in and have a play. You will get a short online evaluation survey. Please tell us what you think, how we can make it better. If you'd like to see more of these sorts of webinars, we can do it. Thank you again. Have a great day wherever you are. Take care.